I realize this Zoom meeting is set to automatically record. So I'm just standing there, not being really careful about my selfie pose, and it's already recording. So I just want to do the balance of the introductory lecture that I had put together for today's class. So I started with the outline, and I feel like we got through about half. I have no idea why I thought I could get through this all in one class session. So I've italicized this part of what the outline was. So we were at what systems affect or determine land use, and we were having a conversation about that. So what I'd like to go through, just finishing up, I want to talk about a little bit more relating directly from this to the earlier work we did in systems. Then talk about, there's some of the models, new models in land use planning are ones I want you to look at in your readings. But I'm going to go through one just to give you a flavor of transit-oriented development, which can be called different kinds of things. And it's a sort of it's a strategy that is being used somewhat in the Prince George context. But I want to give an example from Portland, which has been at it a long time, and it's one of the more successful examples of transit-oriented renovation, like transit-oriented development as renovated into an existing land use pattern. Okay. So what system interventions could change land use patterns? We need to look at what kinds of systems are in operation. We know that there's financial and real estate and economic and political systems. I may need to pause this to calm down my dogs. Why don't I just do that? I'll just pause. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So relating this back to our earlier systems readings in the Meadows book, we can think about what those systems are that are creating land use patterns and maintaining land use patterns, and try to figure out, what kind of systems those are. So I believe, I think that the insights on the common systems are really useful in understanding land use patterns. But we have to think about commons a little bit differently, as not so much the classic common like a park, but also the sort of underlying common systems. Like we were starting to talk about infrastructures of sewer and water and how those were a commons. They're a common resource where one person's action, sort of overuse of the resource, or doing either less or more in relation to, water usage or how much waste or what they put in the waste stream, can really have an impact. And of course, there's a common sense of how many people are using the same water system. So in that sense, water and sewer are commons systems. And then there's common investment in roads and private vehicle use. And that one is an example from the Hall Smith. I can't remember if I gave you that chapter to read or if I just talked about it in a lecture. All of us collectively pay to build and maintain roads. Once the initial development road is done, build, maintain, expand roads, we pay all through our taxes. And then, but it's individual choices that, or whether to use vehicles on those roads, largely individual choices. And in the same way as a park, you can have individuals individually overusing the roads, in sense creating traffic congestion. And there's also a part where we regularly invest way more as a society in creating the infrastructure for private vehicle use than we do in creating the infrastructure for walkability, bicycle lanes, the alternatives that are reasonable for us. Snowshoe lanes, as it were. So there's a lot of common systems in play. Property taxation and the city budget is a common, it's a common wealth. We all pay in, although we might avoid paying in, but we all pay in, and we, through the local political system, decide what we're going to invest in. Political and planning systems. More common systems, the one we were talking about last week when we were starting to look at the floodplain. We have, individuals are either in place on a floodplain or taking action to move to a floodplain, and then that sort of increasing a common insurance cost. Just got my home insurance bill, which has gone up like 25% this year, which I suspect has something to do with the insurers realizing the cost of rural insurance, wildfire, all those things are going up, and all of those, we have a common pool of funds. That's what insurance is. We pay a little to get to participate in this common, and so if insurance, single individuals or people are needing to rely on the insurance system a lot, it will raise the price for everyone. The other one we're starting to talk about in class is like the common of a secure investment environment, the common of everyone's belief in their homeowners' belief in their homeowner, in their home value. So that's a very interesting common, because of course it's a common that is providing benefits to the homeowning class from public investment paid by the homeowning class and the non-home owning class. And then we have another common in terms of we can make investments in affordable housing and densification, even if we aren't individually going to think that we're going to need affordable housing, we might. There's a lot of situations where we might find ourselves in need of various kinds of housing. And so underlying this, we're also looking in this sort of land use pattern domain of a successful kind of system, because we're making a lot of common investments in making sure that we keep homeowners happy. And at the same time, we have a social class structure, wealth structure, where people that have families that have been homeowners are more able to support their youth into acquiring property than non-homeowners. Of course, there's a role of generational wealth there in that system. But it's been such a big change over the last couple of decades in that particular structure. We'll see what happens. And the other one that Cameron was trying to raise towards the end of class, although I think I'm misusing what he said a little bit, but the belief that property values will continue to rise. spurs us to continue to invest in the belief that property values will continue to rise, which means that property values continue to rise. At the same time, yes, if you read, we do have this bubble concept. Economists would, there's some kind of fundamentals in a property market. Imagine in a town that, for example, loses its mill, and a lot of people leave, you'll get lowering in the property values. The city of Detroit, for example, one of my favorite examples, because there's entire subdivisions that have gone either back to the wild or gone to urban gardening. There was a few interesting articles came out about that, and I've lived in several Rust Belt places, so I've seen that where, I talked a little bit about brownfields, but whole neighborhoods, people lose their jobs, abandon their homes. Like there's sort of these holes in the middle of the city that can transform to farming, to food systems. I used to be able to hear roosters and kind of farm animals when I was commuting by bicycle in Louisville, Kentucky. So that's one way. One way to create room for market agriculture in the city is to have is if there's a huge loss of jobs or a huge drop in property value and where people have to leave to go somewhere else. Market fundamentals are sort of, there's a tension between household income and affordability of property. So that's where an economist starts to talk about a property value bubble. And the one in the United States and in some places in Canada was pierced in 2008 when the financial markets crashed. But it hit Canada less hard because we have better regulation of banking, so that our mortgages weren't at risk. But that financial crash lowered a lot of property values in a lot of places. So just so you know, it can happen and does happen. Property values can fall. So those are the types of systems that are in operation. When we look at the reading, like the Purkis reading, for example, they are using systems language. And so what do we know about systems interventions in a common system? What did Meadows tell us about that? That intervening in common systems, I think it's like chapter 6, right, requires a combination of regulatory policy, social institutional change, and education. So if we wanted to address some of the negative consequences of those land use patterns that people are often highly invested in, that is a very interesting system challenge. Its urgency, it seems to me, is it's easily pictured to me on like page 6 of the Prince George climate mitigation, just a little bubble that says, where are Prince George's GHG emissions coming from? And it's over half coming from transportation. So over half the emissions are coming from transportation. A major part of that is private vehicle use, and a major part of the choice horizon of people around using private vehicles in a place like Prince George is that the land use pattern leaves them with few workable choices. That was a simple way to say that argument. Okay. This is what I just said. And I like to focus in on what makes transit a possible choice for people in cities. Now, I work in rural areas and maybe commuting. I work in rural areas and our horizon of possibilities is not as broad. Um, try to think about how rural places can address their transportation GHGs. I really do think about primarily reduction in transportation through remote work, working at home, and changing over from a gasoline network to an electric network. But the cost of doing that in rural areas is going to be so much higher than doing that in the cities. So, but for this, I just want to focus in on the urban context and how do you make transit a possible choice when you have an existing single family home, essentially sprawling land use patterns. So the strategies that you're going to see are in that report from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. How do you densify the land use? One of the questions of, how do you change the lot structure? Developers will assemble lots and then consolidate lots so that they can put a row house on them. That is one way that you can figure out what to do about that underlying legal, the legal structure, the survey structure I was talking about. You can also, through just densifying land use, shift from single family homes to duplexes and row houses. Or as in Prince George, a lot of the single family zones allow secondary suites, and some will also allow carriage or laneway homes. And at the same time, you could build a transit infrastructure that supports either a reduction in cars per household or the need, or makes it so there's no need for a car. So the approach that's called transit-oriented development is that development and transportation should be designed together in relation to one another, which practically they are, but we kind of think about land subdivision as we kind of don't think about implies car. Medium and high density neighborhoods offer a range of benefits in livability, even in a pandemic, although I guess we're going to have to take that into account now, like how do you get in and out of the building and where do you go where you can be distanced. Allow for the provision of convenient and feasible public transportation. And one of the reasons I think that this is still all good knowledge in a pandemic is that Asian cities have had pandemics before and their citizens have a clear set of behavioral, things they do kind of regularly. That still allow them to realize those benefits in livability and walkability and life. Allow for the provision of convenient and feasible public transportation. And so the interesting thing about Portland is looking at how it approached infill of older single family neighborhoods to get them to transit supportive densities. Transit supportive densities. This picture here, which won't look that far from a reality in Prince George, but this is in Portland. So this neighborhood has a density of households that supports regular transit service. So to have a kind of neighborhood where you can have good transit, you need to have a short walking distance to the closest transit stop, and you need to have reasonably frequent service. So that really means there needs to be enough people walking to these transit stops to basically pay for the operation of a bus and driver. So, and I haven't, since I did this about Portland, I was feeling guilty that I need to convert these to hectares. But the minimum average density of a transit supportive neighborhood is 12 to 15 households per acre, and conventional suburbs are 4 to 7 households per acre. So all you have to do is somewhere between double and quadruple the number of households per acre. And sometimes when you talk about density, people imagine that that density comes with reduced safety. And I would just recommend Jane Jacobs. It's an old book, The Life and Death of Cities. What the heck is it called? Man, I have a brain problem today. But denser neighborhoods are often more safe. I have myself experienced the safety of eyes on the street, and my neighbors participating in making me more safe. So I have personal experience of the safety of denser neighborhoods. So here's some other visuals for those of you that haven't been to Portland. So there's a sort of a combination. This scene here is at the bottom right is an area of commercial buildings that is part of the transit network. You have an area of quite high density homes around a park so that people have outdoor space in those. We're going to be talking about nodes, right? And so this picture is of a commercial node. This picture is of a residential node. And this picture is of an infill development in a historically single family neighborhood. I think maybe it's in South Portland. This is either acquiring 2 or 3 lots, I can't really tell, and replacing, but it looks to me like they've replaced 2 single family houses here with at least 6 units and possibly 12. So, Mall of America. So one of the first things, or one of the ingredients, I guess, of shifting a single family land use pattern, and you can actually, possibly you can vaguely see the street pattern and the block sizes here. This is all single family neighborhoods, is identify these nodes. So those first 2 pictures on the last one are down here. The nodes are, sorry, at the top of the map: Nicollet Mall, the Warehouse District, and then identifying nodes within the single family fabric, where basically the buses kind of travel from node to node without much interference, but at a relative frequency that allows for convenient and accessible transit. Sorry, you guys, I just don't know what's wrong with my brain today in terms of how the words are coming out of it. And so at each one of these nodes, the strategy of transit-oriented development is that those are your focus points for densifying the fabric of the housing sufficient to provide for this transit corridor. So through a number of actions, through zoning, through density bonuses through those kinds of tools. You can see this is a 2005 approach. You can see that I can see when I read the map that this node here and this node here in South Portland are when they did this map in 2005, largely single family residential fabric. So the key factors in success is to make sure that there's a walkable distance. Oh, I didn't even mention that. You see how those nodes are subscribed in circles? That's a walkable distance to the node. That there's a walkable distance to the nodes, that the blocks themselves are walkable, that they're in some places the blocks are either too suburban or too long to develop walkability. So that's one of the issues in trying to do transit-oriented development, is sometimes the basic legal fabric needs to be changed, and that's very hard to do. Identifying some redevelopment possibilities, maybe there's vacant lots, maybe there's a couple of houses in a row where there's been underinvestment, making sure that you have a political climate in the neighborhood. Key benefits, there's a lot of environmental benefits. There's key benefits for households who live in transit-oriented development areas because their commuting times are lower, which gives them more life to live, get below the 2-car threshold, even in those single-family neighborhoods. Again, I'm probably not talking about, these are some modest goals with transit-oriented development. There is a political and investment risk for the municipality in doing this kind of strategy. So Prince George's transit-oriented development plan, they have a zoning, they have identified the routes for future regular rapid transit. And they're doing some development cost charge benefits for providing housing closer to the core, denser housing. But some of that, I don't think that they're doing the node strategy along the rapid transit corridors, which requires you to sort of mess with the single family zoning character of some of those streets. And that's a bigger battle back to all those interacting systems. So in terms of what I set out in the module for you to have a look at, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities report on sustainable land use. Now, I actually find the report it's faster for me than the webinar. So I would recommend, if you're like me, you might prefer to just look at the report. But there is also the webinar of the two lead authors talking about the process they went through of engaging with planners all across Canada and what the major land use strategies are, and then of those identifying 10 high impact practices for making land use more sustainable. And then I've chosen selected portions of the Prince George 2020 Climate Mitigation Plan and the Prince George Transit Future Plan. Now, as I look at that, I'm like, well, did I link that yet? I might have decided not to assign that, actually. Yeah, because I'm thinking about the assignment. I think since your assignment is to try to relate the land use pattern systems to what you were thinking is important to the strategic choices. There's so much variation in what you guys are doing. So I want you to just try to incorporate some of this information into your thinking about what likely needs to be changed. Those of you who have chosen Prince George can, of course, fish through the Prince George Sustainability Plan with the caveat that it doesn't say much about transportation. Food systems I kind of talked about in class to Brody, but I think that there are some land use changes that would bring market gardening, or could bring market gardening into Prince George. When I think about how that has been accomplished in other places, admittedly, I'm thinking about Detroit, but you don't have to have a depopulated urban center in order to convert some less used land to somewhat market garden agricultural use. Yeah, I should just go ahead and find that resource for you guys and post that there. Anyway, what is likely to be important in land use and transportation choices and how we intervene in those systems to move towards sustainability in the context where you're working? Okay. Thank you.